Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking, well, quite an ambitious analysis. We're distilling key insights from a really varied stack of sources. We've got documents spanning classical Roman oratory, modern psychological frameworks for success, and even some entrepreneurial philosophy in there.
It's a fascinating collection, definitely. And the core mission today, really, is to try and find those underlying principles,
Yeah.
the ones that govern high performance when you're facing trials or pressure, or let's be honest, just massive information overload, which is pretty common these days. And the synergy we found, maybe a bit unexpected, is that whether you're, delivering a defining speech to the Roman Senate or executing a modern business strategy, true effectiveness seems to be governed by mastering two parallel arenas.
That's right. The first is that internal self, your mindset, your focus, your courage, your principles, all that internal stuff. And the second is the external environment, the deliberate, precise art of influence, persuasion, and, well, creating opportunity. So we're connecting ancient wisdom, like how Cicero taught Romans to argue effectively, to really modern concepts of proactive living and strategic focus. We are entering, you could say, the arena of the mind and looking at the performance required to actually succeed there. Okay, so let's begin with the architecture of influence itself. When we look at the classical world, specifically thinking about traditions rooted in Cicero and Quintilian, they didn't just offer, tips for better speaking. They established this highly rigorous five-part system for structuring thought and delivery. It's a system that's still studied today, which is pretty remarkable.
Absolutely. This is the Ciceronian structure, often called the five canons of rhetoric, and it starts long before the orator even opens their mouth. First is inventio, or
Yeah.
invention. And this isn't just like finding material off the shelf, it's the deep intellectual work of argument mining, really discovering and defining the substance of your case and all the evidence you need to support it.
Okay, so that's the foundation. And once you've done that heavy lifting, that foundational work, you move to arrangement, which is figuring out the optimal structure and flow for the argument, right?
Yeah.
Where do your strongest points go? How do you handle potential objections?
Exactly. Arrangement is crucial. Then following arrangement, we get into the more, shall we say, artistic aspects. There is style, which Cicero famously described using that wonderful phrase, vestire atque ornare oratione.
Ah, yes, clothing and adorning the speech. So making the language not just beautiful, but also fitting, appropriate for the context and the audience.
Precisely. Then, of course, memory, the skill of actually recalling the entire speech, which was vital back then. And finally, delivery, making sure it's presented with dignitat besenstate, or dignity and grace, that involves both voice and gesture. It's a whole performance.
And Quintilian, he sort of crystallized the purpose of this whole system, didn't he? He defined the orator's three essential duties. First, to instruct the audience on the necessary facts. Second, to move them emotionally. And third, to delight the hearers with, well, beautiful language.
He did. And Quintilian makes a really pragmatic observation about those duties. He notes that emotional appeals, they're most effective when they frame the discourse. They work best when deployed right at the very beginning to hook them, and then again at the very end of the speech.
So you start with emotion, end with emotion.
Yeah, basically. The emotional hook captures attention early on, and the emotional appeal in the conclusion helps solidify conviction and, importantly, spur action.
Now that's interesting because in contrast to Cicero's really comprehensive five canons, Aristotle, when he was analyzing just general argumentation, he radically simplified the structure of a speech.
He really did. He stripped it right back to what he saw as the two essential irreducible parts. First, stating the matter, basically, laying out your argument or your thesis. Second, demonstrating it, providing the persuasive evidence to back it up.
That's it, just those two.
For Aristotle, in many contexts, yes. He viewed pretty much everything else, the narrative background, the rebuttals, the epilogue, as potentially secondary fluff, or maybe necessary only in highly specific contexts, like a courtroom setting where telling the story, the narrative, is absolutely essential. But in a public assembly where the goal is simply giving advice on policy, those additions might even be counterproductive. They could distract from the core logical demonstration.
That distinction between the courtroom needing all the parts and the assembly, where swift logic is key, that's crucial because it highlights that we aren't necessarily pursuing absolute philosophical truth here in rhetoric, but rather effective persuasion. Which brings us nicely to, well, one of the most intellectually fascinating parts of the sources, Quintilian's discussion of the epichairem.
Ah, yes, the epichairem. This is where we really see that philosophical crack emerge between pure logic and rhetoric. You see, a true philosophical syllogism, the kind Aristotle loved, is designed to infer truth from two statements that are already known to be absolutely true. For example, all mammals breathe air. A dog is a mammal, therefore a dog breathes air. Simple, clean logic. Truth from truth.
Right, pure logic. So how does the rhetorical version, the epicheirem, differ?
Well, it differs because it often relies on statements that are merely credible or probable, rather than being absolutely certain. The epicheirem is a form of practical reasoning. It's designed not necessarily to prove certainty, but to foster belief in the audience. It's often an incomplete or modified syllogism. One of both premises might just be likely or generally accepted, but not strictly proven.
Can you give an example?
Sure. An argument might be something like, this man is generous, and, generous men are often good citizens, therefore we should elect him.
Hmm.
The premise that generous men are often good citizens. Well, that's credible. People might nod along, but it's definitely not a universal logical truth. There are probably exceptions.
Ah, I see. That's actually a really deep insight for modern communication, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not always about finding the one indisputable logical truth. It's about identifying and utilizing the accepted credible truths within a specific cultural or situational context to build belief.
Precisely. And if believability is the goal, then that entry point, the exordium or the opening of the speech, it absolutely must be flawless. Quintilian warns against a faulty opening. He says it's like a face seamed with scars. It immediately undermines your credibility.
Ouch. So its primary purpose is conciliation, getting the audience on your side, making them receptive.
Exactly. Before you even deploy your arguments, your epicheirons, you need them willing to listen.
This really emphasizes how incredibly sensitive classical rhetoric was to context, and we see this so acutely in Quintilian's advice on style, especially in a crisis.
Yes. He makes a very stark observation about capital charges. So if someone's accused of a crime that could lead to the death penalty, and the defense lawyer uses excessive ornamentation, florid commonplaces, elaborate metaphors, Quintilian says that's totally inappropriate. And crucially, it's counterproductive. Why? Because it destroys the impression of anxiety and sincerity required to elicit pity from the judge or jury. It looks fake.
Wow. So style isn't just an optional extra, an embellishment. It's a necessary tool that has to be deployed specifically to serve the audience's emotional needs and the gravity of the situation. Sorrow, he insists, cannot be expressed in an epigram. The display has to feel genuine, right?
It has to feel genuine. It connects directly to the pragmatic use of rhetorical devices, even something like apostrophe.
That's the diversion of address, right? Talking to someone other than the judge or main audience.
Exactly. Some textbooks apparently banned it from the exordium. But Quintilian was a pragmatist. He argued that if the emotional need for vehemence or force arises and that diversion achieves it, then the rigid rule against using it has to be set aside. Utility proves the point. What works, works.
But this sheer focus on achieving influence, on what works, it brings us back to that much older foundational critique from Plato, channeled through Socrates. Where does mere persuasive success intersect with, well, ethical truth? Is it enough just to be convincing?
Well, Socrates suggests that if you persuade without having a genuine knowledge of the truth you are conveying, then the rhetoric is nothing more than an unsystematic knack. It's just a skill set, like cooking without knowing nutrition. It lacks the necessary ethical and intellectual foundation. For Plato, knowledge of truth is the ultimate criterion for good rhetoric.
And this ties directly into his famous preference for living dialectical conversation over static written speech, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If you're just reading a written speech, Plato argues, it can't respond to questions, it can't restate arguments in a new way if someone's confused, and it certainly can't justify the case with alternative arguments when challenged. It's inert.
Yeah, the written word is static. It cannot defend itself, as he put it.
Whereas the living dialectical conversation, that back and forth, demands real knowledge from the speaker. It allows for constant rejustification and, ideally, truth-seeking. So this tension between Quintilian's pragmatic, context-driven effectiveness and Plato's ethical insistence on truth, it shows us that the greatest minds saw influence as needing deep ethical and structural preparation.
Okay, so what really stands out as we transition here is that the preparation demanded by inventio, that deep intellectual work at the start, is the necessary internal foundation. It's what allows the orator to handle the external pressures of the arena, whether that arena is a Roman Senate or, a modern crisis.
And that intellectual and emotional foundation, that's exactly what allows individuals to maintain performance when the external environment becomes hostile or overwhelming. Which leads us perfectly into the second part of our deep dive. We transition from classical rhetoric to modern psychology here. Because the argument is, essentially, you have to conquer the internal arena before you can effectively deploy external influence. And this notion is powerfully, almost devastatingly demonstrated by Viktor Frankl's experience.
Ah, Frankl. His observations in the concentration camps during World War II, they're just a harrowing testament to the resilience of the human spirit. After the initial paralyzing shock of imprisonment passed, he noted this profound shift. The prisoners largely stopped fearing death itself. The environment had stripped away literally every external freedom, leaving them only with the ultimate singular struggle, which was maintaining personal dignity and inner freedom against this crushing, dehumanizing effect of being treated as nothing more than an assigned number. Just gone.
And the profound insight Frankl draws from this horror is that in the absence of all external control, the one thing you retained, the one thing that couldn't be taken away, was the freedom to choose your response, your attitude towards what was happening. Frankl saw that the difference between those who succumbed to despair and those who somehow maintained an inner core wasn't luck or circumstance. It was a chosen internal interpretation. They chose the dignity of suffering, as he put it. They found meaning in it.
And that connects directly to the Stoic principles that thinkers like, well, Ryan Holiday revisit, doesn't it? This idea that adversity isn't a starter, it's actually a catalyst for growth. Challenges become opportunities, carving you a path forward. As Holiday suggests, great victories often involve resolving really vexing problems with a potent cocktail of creativity, focus, and daring. The things that hurt instruct.
Exactly. This is the very essence of developing an internal locus of control. We see this idea manifested so vividly in individuals like W. Mitchell, the man who faced unimaginable physical challenges, horrific burns, paralysis, but chose to interpret those challenges positively. He communicated encouraging beliefs to himself. He controlled the narrative he told himself about his circumstances. And that internal belief that you determine your response, that really seems to be the difference between overcoming and being overwhelmed by despair.
Right. And this understanding of interpretation of how we frame things internally brings us directly to Stephen Covey's concept of the paradigm shift. He borrows this idea from Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, who used it to describe major scientific breakthroughs.
Yeah, Kuhn's original application was high-level science. Think about the massive intellectual resistance required to shift from the Ptolemaic model, the Earth-centered universe, to Copernicus's sun-centered model. That isn't just accepting new facts, it's tearing down an entire worldview, a whole paradigm. And Covey brilliantly takes that concept and applies it internally. He shows how personal effectiveness often requires that same level of intellectual and perceptual revolution within ourselves.
Yeah, and that transition from a difficult scientific revolution to a simple personal moment, it makes the concept so accessible. The classic subway anecdote Covey uses perfectly illustrates the power of seeing the same facts differently. You remember it. A man on the subway, his children are running wild, totally out of control, causing widespread irritation and anger among the other commuters.
Right. Everyone's shoving him, thinking, get your kids under control. Yet the moment the narrator learns the reason the man's wife had just died in the hospital they were leaving, the perception of the exact same situation completely transforms. Instantly. The facts, the yelling children, didn't change at all. But the framework, the paradigm through which the observer viewed those facts, shifted instantly from irritation and judgment to compassion and sympathy.
And that capacity for a deliberate perceptual shift, that's the foundation of proactivity, Covey's first habit. It's the core idea that we choose our response to circumstances, and that choice powerfully affects the circumstance itself. Proactive individuals focus their energy within their circle of influence, the things they can actually do something about, rather than wasting energy dwelling on the circle of concern, things they can't control.
And this is where personal accountability really comes in. Covey advises that to build inner integrity, which is the engine of influence really, you must work within that circle of influence. How? By making and critically keeping small commitments to yourself first. This builds the character, the self-trust, required to then make and keep commitments to others.
Right. You build trust with yourself before you can build it with others. Makes sense. And crucial to maintaining that proactive effectiveness over the long haul is understanding the PPC balance. This is the balance between production P and production capacity, PC, illustrated by that famous fable of the goose and the golden egg.
Ah, yes, the goose. Everyone intuitively understands the temptation to maximize P to get the most golden eggs right now, today. But the trap of ineffectiveness lies in destroying the PC, the asset that produces the results, the goose itself, for short-term gain. And this applies across all domains. In business, it means overworking employees until they burn out. You're destroying the human asset, the PC. In personal life, it might mean sacrificing your health, your physical PC, for immediate output or pleasure.
If the goose, the PC, is neglected or, worse, killed, production eventually stops altogether. It seems so obvious, but why do you think people consistently fail to prioritize PC?
Well, I think it comes back to immediate gratification, partly,
Mm-hmm.
and also the paradigm shift we just discussed. The immediate gain of P, the golden egg, is visible and measurable today. You can count it. The deterioration of PC, the health of the goose, is often slow, creeping, and only really noticeable when failure is already imminent or has already happened. It requires profound discipline and, frankly, a principle-centered paradigm to make difficult short-term P sacrifices for long-term PC maintenance. Things like choosing to take time for rest or investing heavily in preventative maintenance or relationship building, those don't always show immediate ROI.
That makes a lot of sense. It takes foresight. And sustained focus, the kind needed for that discipline, requires internal harmony, which Mihali's six-step Mihaly called flow. And the enemy of flow, he said, is psychic entropy.
Psychic entropy. That's such a critical term for recognizing internal struggle. It's not just distraction. It's the state where information conflicts with our intentions or simply diverts our attention. This could be physical pain, fear, anxiety, rage, or even just conflicting priorities pulling you in different directions. This causes psychic disorder, basically internal chaos, making our limited psychic energy ineffective and difficult to deploy. We feel scattered, anxious, unable to concentrate.
And flow is the exact opposite state, the optimal experience. It's when our awareness becomes perfectly congruent with the goals of the task at hand. Psychic energy flows effortlessly, we stop worrying about ourselves, our ego fades, and our attention is completely free to deal with the task, which actually strengthens the self.
Right. And this internal architecture, the kind that maximizes attention and minimizes that psychic entropy. Csikszentmihalyi Mihaly and Covey would argue it's best supported by principle-centered living. If you center your life on fleeting external elements like money, status, a specific job, maybe even a spouse or possessions, you introduce constant instability. These things can change or be taken away. They're in the circle of concern, often.
But centering your life on correct, unchanging principles, things like fairness, integrity, contribution, growth, provides a stable core. It gives you security, guidance, wisdom, and power that endure regardless of external conditions. These principles become the bedrock of that internal integrity, the kind that allowed Frankl to survive, and the kind that allows the effective orator, going back to Cicero, to deliver a genuine, convincing performance because they're grounded.
Okay, so once that internal arena is mastered, or at least once you're actively working on it, developing integrity and focus, how do you translate that into external action? How do you find success out there in the world? We move now to identifying and seizing opportunity, starting with Russell Conwell's famous, very popular 19th century lecture, Acres of Diamonds.
Acres of Diamonds. Conwell's argument is so powerfully optimistic, isn't it? The core idea is that every man has the opportunity to make more of himself than he does in his own environment, with his own skill, with his own energy, and with his own friends.
It's a compelling argument against constantly searching for greener grass somewhere else.
Exactly. The premise is that most people overlook the resources and opportunities right under their noses, in their own backyard, so to speak. Why? Because they lack the paradigm shift, the perspective necessary to recognize them, which is why that anecdote of the old farmer seeking oil is so instructive. Right. The farmer who initially saw opportunity elsewhere sold his farm for pennies and left to seek his fortune. And later, the man who bought the farm discovered vast oil reserves right there on the land the first farmer had abandoned.
Yeah. And Conwell uses this not just to preach optimism, but crucially, to emphasize the necessity of knowledge. The farmer in the story who eventually did find success elsewhere, Conwell stresses that he studied the oil business thoroughly first. He went far beyond just superficial knowledge. He apparently studied until he knew what oil looked like, smelled like, tasted like, and how to refine it before he acted.
So the key insight isn't just look around you, it's look around you with knowledge.
Precisely. Moving from just enthusiasm or zeal to expert knowledge is necessary to recognize and then exploit those local opportunities. A diamond right under your feet just looks like a meaningless rock until you have the knowledge to recognize its potential, how to cut it, how to value it.
Now, Conwell then addressed the moral dimension of wealth creation, which is, well, it's fascinating and certainly controversial today. He claimed quite boldly that 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money.
Wow, okay. In today's climate, That statement sounds incredibly naive, maybe even self-serving, particularly given the Gilded Age context in which he spoke. How did he justify such a broad, sweeping moral generalization?
Well, his justification was rooted in separating the tool, money, from the worship of the tool. He actually agreed with the biblical concept that the love of money is the root of all evil, but he clarified that the evil wasn't wealth itself, but the idolatry of the dollar, making money the center of your life, your ultimate principle, instead of seeing it as a tool to be used for good, productive purposes. He argued, essentially, that the ability to accumulate and maintain wealth over time often required the kind of trust that typically comes with integrity and honesty. People wouldn't keep trusting dishonest operators with significant resources, was his argument.
Okay, that distinction is crucial. The tool versus the idolatry of the tool. It links back again to Covey's principles, doesn't it? If integrity making and keeping commitments is the foundation of your internal arena, it naturally enables you to be trusted with external resources like money or responsibility. And this focus on integrity and channeling resources connects perfectly to the idea of strategic focus, as analyzed by Jim Collins in his work on great companies.
Right, Collins, in studying companies that made the leap from good to great, highlights the application of the hedgehog concept.
Mhm.
It's really about the courage required to channel resources into only one or a few core arenas where you can truly excel. The concept itself is pretty simple, focusing intensely on the intersection of three things: what you can be the absolute best in the world at, what drives your economic engine, and what you are deeply passionate about.
The concept is simple, yes, but the difficulty, as Collins points out, is the incredible discipline required to say no to opportunities that are profitable, maybe even easy, but not central to that hedgehog concept. The great companies displayed remarkable courage because they resisted the very strong temptation to hedge their bets by diversifying into too many side ventures that diluted their focus.
And we see this in those classic examples Collins gives. Walgreens, for instance, had to make the really difficult, courageous decision to exit the profitable food service business, their little restaurants inside the stores. Why? To focus entirely on becoming the best, most convenient drugstores in America. That was their hedgehog.
Similarly, Kimberly-Clark had to make the painful choice to channel essentially all its resources into the consumer paper business, going head-to-head with giants like P&G. Even though their traditional industrial paper operations were still generating income, they weren't where Casey could be the best. It took guts to make that bet.
That kind of decision requires real internal self-mastery at an organizational level. The courage to risk short-term profits or familiar territory for long-term strategic focus. And that focused courage is exactly what Theodore Roosevelt celebrated in his famous Man in the Arena speech in philosophy.
Absolutely. Roosevelt's philosophy for national greatness and individual greatness, too, demanded not just physical and moral courage and hardihood,
Mhm.
toughness, but plus, as he emphasized, self-restraint, self-mastery, and the crucial capacity to work effectively for and with others. It's almost a synthesis of the internal discipline we talked about in Section 2, with effective external engagement in action.
And he was a progressive, fighting hard for what he called genuine equality of opportunity for every man and all women to show the stuff there is in him. However, like Conwell perhaps, he made a very clear distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of reward. The goal was to ensure the opportunity was equal, the starting line fair, but the reward should absolutely be unequal, justifying wide inequality of compensation based on the quality and value of the service provided.
Interesting distinction. Okay, so finally, we loop back to strategic communication and influence, because all this internal focus and external action has to result in successful, cooperative execution with other people. Tony Robbins, for example, suggests that one path to success is by modeling others, identifying their effective patterns and actions, and consciously replicating them, learning from those who've already succeeded.
And Stephen Covey brings it all home with the concept of win-win interdependence. This is habit 4. The goal of effective interpersonal leadership, Covey argues, isn't winning at someone else's expense, win-lose, or compromising where nobody's happy, lose-lose. It's finding solutions that we both feel good about. True win-win.
But getting to that genuine win-win state, it requires deep listening first. That's habit 5, empathic listening, where you seek first to truly understand the other person's perspective, their needs, their concerns, before you try to make your own case or be understood.
And then habit 6, synergy, is about taking that understanding and collaboratively producing a third alternative, something genuinely new and better than what either side proposed initially, 1 plus 1 equal 3 or 10 or 100.
Exactly. But, and this is a huge but, those advanced habits, 4, 5, and 6, they are essentially pointless. They don't work without a strong foundation of trust. Or what Covey calls a high balance in the emotional bank account between the people involved. If that account is low, if trust is broken, agreements mean very little.
Why? Because they lack the character and the relationship base to sustain them in spirit, not just in letter.
Precisely. Which leads us to the ultimate failure state of influence when trust is gone. Malicious obedience.
Ah, malicious obedience. That's such a high-impact concept and often overlooked. Can you unpack that?
Malicious obedience occurs when there's extremely low trust and therefore low commitment. The person being commanded, maybe an employee or even a partner, they do exactly what is asked of them. They follow the rules and specifications to the absolute letter, meticulously. But they take absolutely no responsibility for the result. They're externally compliant, but internally resistant. Often their precise obedience is designed to achieve the opposite of the desired result, maybe to prove a point, highlight the inadequacy of the command, or simply abdicate responsibility.
Wow. It's the ultimate breakdown of external influence, isn't it? Doing exactly what you're told, even if you know it will lead to disaster, just to be able to say, well, I did what you asked.
It's total passive-aggressive sabotage. And it highlights perfectly that all the tools of rhetoric, the clever epicuremy, the flawless exordium, the win-win negotiation techniques, they become moot. They fall apart if the foundation of integrity, trust, and focused good faith action is missing. The relationship and the character of the people involved must precede the agreement for it to truly work. #outro. So we started way back with the rigorous architecture of Cicero's 5 parts of a flawless speech, and we've journeyed through mindset, survival, opportunity. And we're ending here with Covey's 6 habits of synergistic action that can be completely destroyed by just one failure of trust, leading to something like malicious obedience. The consistent lesson, spanning all these diverse sources, seems to be that effectiveness, whether you are trying to inspire a nation through oratory or just transform your own life, it flows from a self-defined, principle-centered core. You really must know your why, your internal paradigm, your principles, before your what, your external actions, can truly move the external world in a meaningful way.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that the art of persuasion, going back to Cicero, and the capacity for practical success, like Conwell talked about, they both rely so heavily on that internal preparation, that mindset, and the focused execution that leaders like Franklin Roosevelt modeled in their own ways. Success doesn't seem to be about hedging bets or just hoping for luck. It really is about the deliberate, focused deployment of energy, guided by clear principles.
And that focused courage is often what makes the crucial difference. We discussed the idea that great results, like Collins found in companies, are often achieved by channeling resources and courage into a single, focused arena, resisting that constant temptation to hedge your bets across multiple divergent opportunities, even if they look appealing. So if that focused courage is indeed a key to unlocking your highest potential, then maybe consider this provocative thought as you finish this deep dive. What one major goal or path right now in your life or work are you perhaps avoiding focusing on, avoiding committing to fully? Simply because the path forward involves accepting a new, perhaps harder, maybe uncomfortable, internal paradigm. What internal shift are you resisting?
Something to definitely think about, that internal paradigm shift and the courage it requires. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.